One of key differentiator between conscious and non-conscious entities is the accumulation of knowledge. Conscious entities accumulate knowledge from various inputs that come to their memory space. This video will talk about the first knowledge, which is defined here as justified information. The Latin cogito, ergo sum, usually translated into English as I think, therefore I am, is the first principle of René Descartes' philosophy. As Descartes explained in a margin note, we cannot doubt of our existence while we doubt. Descartes' statement became a fundamental element of Western philosophy, as it purported to provide a certain foundation for knowledge in the face of radical doubt. While other knowledge could be a figment of imagination, deception, or mistake, Descartes asserted that the very act of doubting one's own existence served, at minimum, as proof of the reality of one's own mind. There must be a thinking entity, in this case the self, for there to be a thought. The phrase first appeared, in French, in Descartes' 1637 discourse on the method in the first paragraph of its fourth part. Accordingly, seeing that our senses sometimes deceive us, I was willing to suppose that there existed nothing really such as they presented to us, and because some men are in reasoning, and fall into paralogisms, even on the simplest matters of geometry, I, convinced that I was as open to error as any other, rejected as false all the reasonings I had hitherto taken for demonstrations, and finally, when I considered that the very same thoughts, presentations, which we experience when awake may also be experienced when we are asleep, while there is at that time not one of them true, I suppose that all the objects, presentations, that had ever entered into my mind when awake, had in them no more truth than the illusions of my dreams. But immediately upon this I observed that, whilst I thus wished to think that all was false, it was absolutely necessary that I, who thus thought, should be something, and as I observed that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and of such evidence that no ground of doubt, however extravagant, could be alleged by the skeptics capable of shaking it, I concluded that I might, without scruple, accept it as the first principle of the philosophy of which I was in search.
At the beginning of the second meditation, having reached what he considers to be the ultimate level of doubt, his argument from the existence of a deceiving God, Descartes examines his beliefs to see if any have survived the doubt. In his belief in his own existence, he finds that it is impossible to doubt that he exists. Even if there were a deceiving God, or an evil demon, one's belief in their own existence would be secure, for there is no way one could be deceived unless one existed in order to be deceived. First, he claims only the certainty of his own existence from the first-person point of view. He has not proved the existence of other minds at this point. This is something that must be thought through by each of us for ourselves, as we follow the course of the meditations. Second, he does not say that his existence is necessary. He says that if he thinks, then necessarily he exists. Third, this proposition I exist is held true not based on a deduction, as mentioned above, or on empirical induction but on the clarity and self-evidence of the proposition. Descartes does not use this first certainty, the cogito, as a foundation upon which to build further knowledge, rather, it is the firm ground upon which he can stand as he works to discover further truths. Descartes started by realizing that we can doubt everything that we think is true. In other words, any assumption that we take can either be true or false. But one assumption cannot be true, because it would generate contradiction. We cannot reasonably assume that we don't exist while making that assumption. Making assumption is a form of thinking. So is doubting anything. Doing all those things requires existence. It's the only self-evident assumption. Other axioms are essentially justified by some more trusted other axioms, and they all eventually rely their justifications on the continual truth of the first axiom, i.e., the existence of a conscious entity thinking about its own existence. It's basically the generalization of Planck's principle. This was formulated by Max Planck, and new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. An important scientific innovation rarely makes its way by gradually winning over and converting its opponents. It rarely happens that Saul becomes Paul. What does happen is that its opponents gradually die out, and that the growing generation is familiarized with the ideas from the beginning, another instance of the fact that the future lies with the youth. Max Planck, Scientific Autobiography, 1950, p. 33, 97. Colloquially, this is often paraphrased as science progresses one funeral at a time. It doesn't mean that every axiom believed by an existing conscious entity must be true, though. It only means that if some of the axioms accepted by the existing conscious entity are false, they are not important enough, at least for the time and place where the entity exists so far. They may become important in some other time and places, where embracing their false axioms will lead to the entity stop existing. It implies that conscious entities who have survived many different conditions must have accumulated many important true assumptions. In order to keep their own existence, they must construct those true assumptions in some ways to help them make correct decisions effectively and efficiently in timely manner. Eventually, they will build an accurate and precise virtual universe. Unless if they go extinct first. When they face an entirely new condition that they know nothing about, they are forced to make random assumptions. If those assumptions turn out to be important for their existence, then the only reliable way to survive is to have some backup or duplicate entities making different decisions based on those possible assumptions. Some of those copies might make the correct assumptions, continue to survive and reproduce. They will replace the copies who made false assumptions and died out consequently. This kind of situation is often found in unicellular organisms and other lowly conscious entities. Accumulated true assumptions will be organized to build models of the universe. They don't need to be infinitely accurate and precise models. If they are practical, they only need to be better than the previous models. In many cases, some data compression techniques can be used. Some false assumptions may remain in existing models, if they don't lead to fatal decisions. Some backups are necessary to compensate for the imperfections, just in case they lead to wrong important decisions which may cause extinction. Less accurate and precise models need more backups, which would be less efficient. But excessively accurate and precise models are also less efficient and require more power, time, and other resources. There would be some optimal and balanced compositions for different cases and different conditions and importance. Let me remind you about basic function block diagram of consciousness from my previous video. Among many parts of consciousness, the doubting and thinking actions only justifies the existence of current state depiction in memory space of a conscious entity. It doesn't justify the entity's own existence in the past nor the future, nor any other information in its memory space. Besides functional partitioning, the memory space of a conscious entity can also be divided into inward and outward depictions. Self-awareness comes from this inward depiction, in contrast to outward depiction which describes the environment. Note that the boundary is not a clear-cut and somewhat fuzzy. For example, is a cup of water that we drink an hour ago becomes part of us? What about our gut bacteria? Surely they can affect our decisions. But are they part of us?